The afternoon of human life must also have a significance of its own and cannot be merely a pitiful appendage to life's morning. There's a strange phenomenon that happens to most of us somewhere in our fourth decade. We wake up one morning and realize that the person we've been trying to become is not the person we actually are. The ambitions that drove us through our 20s and 30s, the career milestones, the material accomplishments, the need to prove ourselves suddenly feel hollow, like echoes in an empty room. And in that hollowness, something else begins to stir. Something we've been ignoring for decades. The Swiss psychiatrist Carl Jung spent much of his career studying this transformation. He noticed that his patients who came to him in the first half of life suffered from very different problems than those who came in the second half. The younger patients struggled with questions of adaptation, how to establish themselves in the world, how to achieve success, and how to build relationships and careers. But the older patients, those over 40, came with a different kind of suffering. They had often achieved everything they set out to accomplish, yet they felt profoundly unfulfilled. They had won the game, but the victory tasted like ash. Jung called this transition the shift from the morning of life to the afternoon of life. And he believed that if we try to live the afternoon by the same rules that govern the morning, we are destined for psychological crisis. In the first half of life, our task is expansion. We venture out into the world like conquistadors, planting flags on new territories. We establish our identity through differentiation, by becoming someone distinct from our parents, our community, and our origins. We accumulate relationships, achievements, possessions, and knowledge. We build what Jung called the persona, the mask we present to the world, the social role we perform. This persona is necessary. It's how we function in society, how we earn our bread, and how we navigate the complex web of human relationships. The ambitious executive, the devoted parent, the successful artist, and the respected professional, these are the personas we construct and inhabit, and in youth, this construction feels like the whole story. We believe that if we can just get the persona right, if we can just achieve enough, accumulate enough, and prove ourselves enough, then we will find fulfillment. But the persona is only half of who we are, and it's a half that becomes increasingly insufficient as we age. Around 40, sometimes earlier, sometimes later, a peculiar dissatisfaction begins to creep in. Jung observed this with uncanny consistency in his practice. Successful people would come to him, people who by all external measures had made it, and they would describe a profound sense of meaninglessness. The goals that once motivated them no longer held appeal. The persona they had spent decades constructing began to feel like a prison. This is not a mere midlife crisis in the popular sense, the cliché of sports cars and affairs. This is something deeper, more fundamental. It's the psyche itself demanding a reorientation. The unconscious, which we have ignored or repressed in favor of external achievement, begins to assert itself with increasing force. Jung noticed that his patients would experience this through symptoms: depression that had no clear cause, anxiety that seemed to come from nowhere, and a haunting sense that life was passing them by even as they accomplished more and more. Some would have vivid dreams that disturbed them, dreams that seemed to be delivering messages they couldn't decode. Others would find themselves suddenly attracted to things they had dismissed in their youth: spirituality, philosophy, art, and solitude. What was happening, Jung understood, was that the unlived life was demanding to be lived. Throughout the first half of life, we necessarily suppress certain parts of ourselves. We learn quickly what is acceptable and what is not. The ambitious career woman suppresses her desire for quiet contemplation. The rational scientist suppresses his attraction to the mystical. The strong provider suppresses his vulnerability. The free spirit suppresses her need for structure. Jung called these suppressed elements the shadow, all the parts of ourselves that we deem unacceptable, incompatible with our persona, and threatening to our self-image. And for decades, we can maintain this division. We can keep the shadow at bay through busyness, through achievement, and through distraction. But after 40, the shadow begins to insist. It emerges in strange ways. The successful businessman who suddenly can't stand his own reflection, the devoted mother who fantasizes about disappearing, the rational academic who becomes obsessed with mysticism, and the disciplined athlete who can no longer summon motivation. These aren't signs of failure or weakness. They're signs that the psyche is trying to balance itself, to integrate what has been left out. The afternoon of life demands that we turn inward and reckon with the person we actually are, not just the person we've been pretending to be. This turning inward is not comfortable. It requires what Jung called the confrontation with the unconscious, a deliberate descent into the parts of ourselves we've been avoiding. This means facing uncomfortable truths, that we're not as moral as we believed, not as rational, not as independent, and not as strong. It means acknowledging the parts of ourselves that are petty, jealous, afraid, dependent, and irrational. But it also means discovering capacities we didn't know we had. The person who has lived by logic alone discovers a wellspring of intuition. The person who has been entirely focused on others discovers a capacity for solitude and self-reflection. The person who has been entirely serious discovers a capacity for play. Jung's own life illustrated this transition. In his 30s, he was a rising star in psychiatry, the heir apparent to Freud, driven by ambition and the need for recognition. But when he broke with Freud around age 38, he entered what he called his confrontation with the unconscious, a period of intense inner turmoil where he questioned everything he had built. He retreated from his professional ambitions. He began to have powerful dreams and visions. He started what would become his Red Book, a private journal where he dialogued with figures from his unconscious archetypes, as he would later call them. To the outside world, he appeared to be having a breakdown, but Jung understood it as a breakthrough, the necessary destruction of his persona, so that something more whole could emerge. The task of the second half of life, Jung argued, is not achievement, but integration. It's not about becoming more of what we already are, but about becoming whole. And wholeness requires incorporating the rejected, the denied, and the shadowed parts of ourselves. This is the process Jung called individuation, the journey toward becoming a complete individual, not just a collection of social roles and expectations. It means withdrawing our projections, the ways we've been seen in others, what we refuse to see in ourselves. It means accepting our limitations, our mortality, and our fundamental aloneness, even in relationships. The person who has lived by power and achievement must learn receptivity and surrender. The person who has lived by pleasing others must learn healthy selfishness. The person who has avoided all conflict must learn to stand their ground. The person who has been rigidly principled must learn flexibility and compassion. This doesn't mean abandoning our persona entirely. We still need to function in the world, to meet our responsibilities, and to maintain our relationships. But the persona becomes something we wear more lightly, something we can take off when we come home to ourselves. We stop identifying completely with our role and begin to identify with something deeper, something Jung called the self, the totality of our being, conscious and unconscious. As we integrate our shadow and loosen our grip on the persona, something shifts in our relationship to life. The questions that drove us in youth, how to succeed, how to win, how to accumulate, to give way to different questions. What does my life mean? What is my purpose beyond my social role? How do I want to spend my remaining time? What legacy do I want to leave? Not in terms of achievement, but in terms of who I became. Jung noticed that many of his older patients spontaneously became interested in spiritual and philosophical questions. This wasn't regression or escapism. It was the natural movement of the psyche toward questions of ultimate meaning. Having established themselves in the outer world, they were ready to explore the inner world. This is why Jung believed that religious and spiritual traditions, at their best, are not superstitious holdovers from humanity's childhood, but profound maps of the second half of life. The symbols and practices of religion, contemplation, meditation, prayer, ritual, are technologies for inner work, for the process of individuation. The figures of wisdom traditions, the elder, the sage, the wise woman, represent the potential of the afternoon of life. The person who dismisses all this as nonsense in their youth often finds themselves inexplicably drawn to it after 40. not because they've become irrational, but because the rational mind, having served its purpose in establishing them in the world, proves insufficient for navigating the questions that now arise. One thing that changes dramatically after 40 is our relationship to death. In youth, death is an abstraction, something that happens to other people, something far off in the distant future. We can afford to live as if we're immortal, as if there's infinite time to become who we want to be. But after 40, death becomes real. We start to lose people, parents, friends, sometimes peers. Our bodies begin to betray us in small ways. We realize that we're past the halfway point. And this realization, if we don't run from it, changes everything. Carl Jung observed that many of his patients after 40 were not just facing the fear of death, but the fear of never having truly lived. They had spent decades building and achieving and accumulating, but they had not spent time being. They had not spent time with the questions that actually matter. The acceptance of mortality, Jung argued, is essential to the second half of life. Not a morbid obsession with death, but a clear-eyed acknowledgement that our time is finite. This acceptance doesn't lead to despair, it leads to authenticity. When we know our time is limited, we stop wasting it on what doesn't matter. We stop performing for others. We stop postponing our real life until some future moment when conditions will be perfect. The awareness of death becomes a teacher, showing us what actually has value, what actually deserves our attention, and what actually makes us feel alive. Something else happens after 40. We come to terms with our limitations. In youth, we believe anything is possible. We believe we can be anything, do anything, and have anything. This is necessary for the energy of youth, for the audacity required to venture into the world. But after 40, we realize that we cannot be everything. Choosing one path means not choosing countless others. Developing certain potentials means other potentials remain undeveloped. We realize that the self we've become is not the infinite possibility we imagined in youth. It's a specific, limited, finite expression of being human. For many people, this realization brings grief, the death of infinite possibility, the acceptance that certain dreams will never be realized, certain versions of ourselves will never come to be. But Jung argued that this grief, if we allow ourselves to feel it, opens into something else, the freedom of limitation. When we accept that we cannot be everything, we can finally embrace what we actually are. When we stop comparing ourselves to infinite possibility, we can appreciate the specific gifts and qualities we do possess. The afternoon of life is not about maximizing potential, it's about savoring actuality. Jung noticed that genuine wisdom rarely appears before the second half of life. This isn't because younger people are stupid, they're often more intellectually sharp, more energetic, and more capable of learning and achievement. But wisdom is not the same as intelligence or knowledge. Wisdom comes from having lived, from having made mistakes, from having confronted suffering and limitation, and from having integrated shadow. Wisdom is the capacity to hold paradox, the recognition that opposite things can be simultaneously true, that we can be both strong and vulnerable, both independent and dependent, and both certain and uncertain. Youth tends toward absolutism. Things are right or wrong, good or bad, true or false. Age, if we've done the work of individuation, brings nuance. Wisdom is also the capacity to see patterns across time, to recognize that the crisis we're facing now rhymes with crises we've faced before. To understand that the suffering is temporary, that the darkness will lift, that this too shall pass, not because we're optimists, but because we've lived through enough cycles to trust the process. And wisdom is the capacity for compassion, particularly self-compassion. We become less judgmental of ourselves and others because we've seen how complex human motivation is, how much we're all struggling, and how much grace we all need. This wisdom, Jung argued, is the gift the older person can offer to the community, not the driven achievement of youth, but the perspective of age. Not the passion to change the world, but the patience to accept it while working steadily toward what can be changed. Jung made a provocative claim: the second half of life is preparation for death. This sounds dark, even nihilistic, but Jung didn't mean we should spend our later years in morbid contemplation. He meant that the work of individuation, of becoming whole, of integrating shadow, of loosening identification with ego, is precisely what allows us to face death without terror. The person who has lived only in the persona, who has identified completely with their social role and achievements, faces death with horror. Because death means the annihilation of everything they believe themselves to be. But the person who has done the work of individuation, who has discovered something deeper than ego, something Jung called the self, they can face death differently. Not without sadness, not without the natural human resistance to endings, but without the existential terror of complete annihilation. Because they've already experienced, in the process of individuation, a kind of death, the death of the ego's dominance, the death of the persona they were clinging to. Jung was influenced by Eastern philosophies, particularly the Tibetan conception of preparing for death through spiritual practice. The afternoon of life, he suggested, is our opportunity to do this preparation, not by withdrawing from life, but by engaging with it more deeply, more authentically, with less attachment to outcomes and more presence to experience. Despite all this talk of shadow and death and limitation, Jung insisted that the second half of life could be immensely joyful. Not the exuberant joy of youth, which comes from expansion and possibility, but a deeper joy, what he called the joy of completeness. This is the joy of no longer having to prove yourself, the joy of knowing who you are and being at peace with it, the joy of having integrated enough shadow that you're no longer at war with yourself, the joy of pursuing meaning rather than achievement, the joy of depth rather than breadth. It's the joy of the elder sitting under a tree, watching the young ones rush about with their ambitions and schemes, and smiling not with superiority, but with recognition. I was once like that. And it was necessary, but this, here, now this quiet afternoon where I don't have to be anywhere or become anyone, this has its own beauty. Jung believed that our culture does a tremendous disservice by devaluing the second half of life. We worship youth, vitality, productivity. We measure people's worth by their achievements and accumulations. And so when people reach 40 and begin to feel the pull towards something different, they think something is wrong with them. They think they're failing. But nothing is wrong. The psyche is simply moving into its natural second phase. And if we resist this movement, if we try to live the afternoon by the morning's rules, we create suffering. We become the old person desperately clinging to youth, the successful person who never stops achieving, the persona so rigid it can never be removed. Jung had a haunting phrase, the unlived life. These are all the potentials we didn't explore, all the versions of ourselves we didn't become, and all the experiences we didn't allow ourselves to have. And Jung believed that the unlived life doesn't simply disappear, it haunts us. It creates symptoms, anxiety, depression, compulsions, and strange attractions we can't explain. The afternoon of life gives us a second chance. Not to do everything we didn't do, that's still the logic of youth, the fantasy of infinite possibility, but to recognize what within us still wants to live, still needs expression, and to make space for it, even in small ways. The rational person taking up painting. The serious professional is learning to play. The independent person allowing themselves to need others. The controlled person permitting themselves some wildness. These aren't hobbies or distractions. They're the unlived life asking for its moment in the sun. And when we give it that moment, something releases. The depression lifts a little. The anxiety quiets. We feel more whole, more ourselves. Not because we've achieved something new, but because we've included something we've been excluding. The goal, ultimately, is not to abandon the first half of life for the second. It's to integrate them. To maintain our capacity for engagement with the world while developing our capacity for depth and interiority, to keep our persona functional while no longer identifying with it completely. To remain productive while no longer being driven by compulsion. This integration is difficult because these two orientations, outward and inward, achievement and being, persona and self, can feel contradictory. But Jung insisted they're complementary. We need both. And the mark of genuine maturity is the ability to move fluidly between them, to be fully present in our work and relationships, and then to be fully present in our solitude and self-reflection, to engage passionately with projects and causes, and then to let them go without attachment, to care deeply about the world, and yet to recognize that our peace doesn't depend on how the world goes. This is the dance of the afternoon of life, and it requires practice, patience, and above all, compassion for ourselves as we fumble through it. If there's one message from Jung's work on the second half of life, it's this: the call to change, the stirring of dissatisfaction, and the pull toward depth. These are not problems to be solved. They're invitations to be accepted. We can spend our 40s, 50s, and 60s trying to recapture the energy and ambition of youth. We can fill our lives with busier and busier schedules, more and more achievements, and desperate attempts to prove we're still vital, still relevant. Or we can listen to what the psyche is actually asking for. It's asking us to turn inward, to get quiet, to face what we've been avoiding, to integrate what we've been denying, to become whole rather than merely successful. This doesn't mean abandoning our responsibilities or our relationships. It doesn't mean becoming self-absorbed. True individuation, Jung insisted, makes us more capable of genuine relationship, not less. Because we're no longer projecting our unlived life onto others, no longer demanding they complete us, and no longer using them to avoid ourselves. The afternoon of life, Carl Jung believed, is when we finally have the opportunity to become who we actually are. Not who our parents wanted us to be, not who society demands, not who we thought we should be, but who we are in our essence. And that person, that essential self, has been waiting patiently all this time, waiting for us to stop running, stop achieving, and stop performing. Waiting for us to sit down, get quiet, and finally say, "I'm ready now. Show me who I really am." The afternoon has its own light, softer than morning, but richer. And if we're willing to enter it fully, willing to leave behind the frantic energy of youth for the deeper engagement of age, we discover that this second half is not the decline we feared. It's the culmination we've been preparing for all along.